The frontier town of Redstone lay cradled between jagged cliffs and endless prairie, a dusty little settlement where life moved at the pace of horses and wind. Its wooden buildings bore the marks of time and weather, sun-bleached and creaking with every gust. Townsfolk hurried about their daily tasks, but that afternoon, even the clamor of the saloon seemed to quiet in anticipation of something new, something dangerous. The doors of the saloon swung open with a sharp creak and every eye turned. He stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly wild, like a force of nature itself had taken human form. His long black hair tumbled past his shoulders, catching the sunlight that spilled through the windows. His skin bore the bronze hue of the desert, and the faint scars along his arms hinted at battles fought and survived. He wore minimal clothing, enough to honor his Apache heritage and strike fear into anyone who might underestimate him. The faint jingling of tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists added an almost hypnotic rhythm to his every movement. People whispered. Some admired him, some feared him, but none dared approach. He moved with the confidence of a man who had survived the wilderness and all its perils, a predator in a land of prey. Yet as he scanned the room, it wasn't the men's gawking that held his attention. It was her. She stood near the bar, a flame of defiance in human form. Her chestnut hair framed a face that could have been delicate, if not for the fire in her green eyes. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, and yet her presence was impossible to ignore. Where others shrank under his gaze, she held it with unwavering boldness, a spark of daring that intrigued him immediately. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to narrow. The chatter of the saloon faded into nothing, leaving only the silent challenge in her stare. He could see the curiosity, the thrill, even the defiance flickering there, and it both unnerved and exhilarated him. This wasn't some timid girl who would shrink away. She was fearless, maybe reckless, but fearless all the same. He took a slow step toward her, his boots thudding against the worn wooden floor. Each movement was deliberate, a silent declaration of strength. His voice, low and controlled, finally broke the tense air. "I'm too big for you," he warned, not with malice but with a caution born of experience. He had learned that his size, his power, and the intensity that clung to him could overwhelm the unprepared. And he could sense somehow that she was testing the limits of that warning already. She tilted her head, a mischievous smirk curving her lips. "Is that a challenge?" she asked lightly, though her tone carried an edge of audacity. The smirk lingered, teasing, inviting, daring him to see if he could back up his words. For a heartbeat he hesitated. He had faced countless men and survived countless fights, but something about her presence stirred something unfamiliar within him, a mixture of admiration, desire, and a rare sense of curiosity. No one had looked at him like she did, with both boldness and a hint of playfulness that refused to bow. Around them, the saloon resumed its usual rhythm, though whispers still hung like smoke in the air. Patrons stole glances, sensing a tension that was more than mere attraction. It was a spark that promised fire. The wild Apache and the fearless woman sized each other up, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Neither would back down, and neither would be the same after this meeting. That first encounter wasn't dramatic or loud. It was a collision of spirit and will. It set the tone for everything that would follow, a silent promise that the days ahead would be anything but ordinary. In that brief moment, the frontier held its breath, watching as two storms, wild in their own ways, prepared to collide. The wind rattled the saloon doors, as if echoing the unspoken tension. And in the quiet that followed, he realized something he had never admitted before. She was the first person in a long time who made him feel both the thrill of danger and the pull of something entirely unknown. The Apache's towering figure loomed over her as the saloon's dim light cast shadows across his chiseled features. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew attention without effort, yet his presence wasn't meant for casual encounters. It was a force that demanded respect, caution, even fear, and he had made it clear from the moment their eyes met. He was dangerous, unpredictable, untamed. He took a step closer, and the wooden floorboards groaned beneath his weight, an almost audible warning. His dark eyes, intense and unwavering, fixed on her as he spoke in a low, measured tone. "I'm too big for you," he said again, almost as if repeating it would impress the gravity of his caution upon her. His words weren't meant to mock. They were meant to protect her from herself, from the irresistible pull she seemed to have toward him, and perhaps from the chaos that clung to him like a second skin. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back slightly against the bar, letting her gaze meet his with a calm defiance that made his warning both thrilling and frustrating. Her chestnut hair fell across her shoulders, and she tucked a stray strand behind her ear, a small gesture of confidence. "Is that a threat? Or a challenge?" she asked lightly, her tone teasing but deliberate. Her green eyes held a spark of daring, a promise that she wasn't the kind of woman who cowered before danger or intimidation. He studied her, intrigued and unsettled. Most people shrank under his presence. Most people didn't look at him with the same fearless curiosity. But she did. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn away. She stood her ground, and it was maddeningly captivating. He had spent years learning how to survive in a harsh world, relying on his size, skill, and instincts to protect himself. But he wasn't used to someone matching him, eye for eye, daring for daring. The saloon around them buzzed with murmurs. Townsfolk sensed the tension between the two, though none could fully understand it. Men and women alike watched with a mix of fascination and apprehension. Here was a woman who refused to be intimidated by a man who could have crushed half the town with ease. And here was a man who, for the first time in years, had met his match in audacity. He exhaled slowly, a breath that carried both frustration and fascination. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said, voice low and rough, almost a growl. "I'm not like the others. I'm dangerous. My world, it isn't safe for someone like you." His warning wasn't just about physical danger. It was about the life he led, the battles he had fought, the wildness that followed him wherever he went. She tilted her head, letting a small, knowing smile play at the corners of her lips. "Maybe I like dangerous," she said softly, almost provocatively. Her words weren't reckless. They were deliberate, a quiet declaration that she wasn't afraid of the fire he carried. She leaned forward slightly, her boldness bridging the space between them, yet keeping just enough distance to tease him. For a moment he froze, caught between his instincts and his growing curiosity. Her fearless demeanor ignited something deep within him, a mix of desire, admiration, and the rare thrill of meeting someone who didn't shrink from him. He had warned her, and yet in that very warning he had unknowingly invited her into his world, a world he had kept carefully hidden from others. The tension between them thickened, palpable and electric. Neither spoke for a heartbeat, letting the charged silence stretch. Every subtle movement, the way she shifted on her feet, the way he tensed with barely contained strength, was a silent conversation, a test of wills. He finally exhaled again, a sound of reluctant concession. He knew this wasn't over. This woman, bold and unafraid, had crossed the first boundary of his carefully controlled life. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't want her to step back. The Apache warrior's warning had been clear, but her defiance made one thing undeniable. The world they were about to enter together would be anything but ordinary. The day after their first charged encounter, the Apache's presence seemed to linger in the town like a restless wind. He didn't speak to her immediately, but the air between them was thick with unspoken tension and curiosity. She, on the other hand, thrived on it. There was a spark in her chest she couldn't ignore, a mixture of fear, excitement, and the thrill of someone who could match her wit and spirit. By mid-afternoon, the two found themselves near the edge of town, at the old wooden corral where the town's horses were kept. He leaned against a post, his massive frame relaxed but alert, eyes sharp as he observed her approach. She walked with a casual confidence, hands on her hips, daring him to say something. And he did. "You're bold," he said, his voice low and smooth, carrying that undertone of warning she'd come to recognize. "Too bold for most women. I wonder, can you back it up?" She smirked, a playful glint lighting her green eyes. "Back it up?" she echoed. "You mean like a wager?" Her voice held teasing confidence, but beneath it was a careful calculation. She wanted to test him, to see if his warnings were true. He tilted his head, intrigued. "A wager," he repeated, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Perhaps, but you should know. My world isn't safe for the careless." "Then I guess I'll be careful," she said lightly, but her tone carried no fear. Instead, it carried challenge. Or maybe I like being a little reckless, and so began their game. At first, it was small things, a race to catch a loose horse, each trying to outmaneuver the other. She was quick, resourceful, and surprisingly, clever, managing to anticipate his moves more often than not. He, in turn, tested her courage, daring her to climb precarious rocks and follow him through the narrow canyons that surrounded Redstone. Each time, she met his challenges with a daring grin, refusing to back down. As the hours passed, their interactions became more personal, more teasing. He would throw a challenge, testing her reflexes or judgment, and she would respond with equal cunning, pushing him to react in ways he hadn't anticipated. He began to notice the little things, the way she studied him, assessing his strength and limits, and the way her laughter carried both amusement and approval. But beneath the playful rivalry, something deeper was stirring. With every challenge, he found himself drawn to her courage, her fearless nature, and her ability to see him not just as a wild, intimidating warrior, but as a man with depth and heart. She, in turn, felt the pull of his intensity, the raw strength tempered by surprising patience and the occasional flicker of vulnerability in his dark eyes. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, the two stood side by side, catching their breath. Neither had truly won their contests, and yet, both had learned something essential about the other. He had discovered a partner in her spirit, someone who could challenge him, someone who refused to be cowed by danger or intimidation. She had discovered a man who was formidable yet not invincible, fierce yet not heartless. The game had become more than a test of courage or skill. It had become a delicate dance, a silent conversation filled with glances, smiles, and subtle touches. Every movement carried meaning. Every playful taunt was a thread weaving a connection neither could ignore. Finally, as shadows stretched long across the prairie, he spoke, his voice rough but softer than before. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met. Bold, clever, and foolish enough to chase danger." He glanced at her, eyes lingering on her face. "I wonder how far you'd go." She tilted her head, lips curving into that fearless smile he was beginning to crave. "Far enough to see what you're really like," she said. Her words weren't a challenge. They were an invitation. And in that moment, the air between them hummed with anticipation, a promise that the game was far from over, and that something wild, dangerous, and irresistible was taking root. The Apache warrior didn't answer immediately, but inside, a storm was stirring. He had met his match, and neither of them would ever be the same. The sun had dipped low, casting a warm amber glow across the prairie, and the air carried that sharp edge that comes just before nightfall in the Wild West. The Apache and the fearless woman found themselves outside the town, near the edge of a rugged canyon that promised danger and adventure alike. The playful banter of earlier hours had faded, replaced by a tension that neither dared ignore. It wasn't just attraction, it was a collision of wills, a test of limits that neither of them had expected. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, and imposing, yet there was a subtle shift in his posture, a wariness, a recognition of her courage that stirred something unfamiliar inside him. She approached him slowly, each step deliberate, her chest rising with the steady rhythm of confidence. His dark eyes followed her every move, alert to her intentions, and yet powerless to resist the pull she radiated. "You've been testing me all day," he said, voice low and rough, carrying that mix of warning and curiosity that had become his signature. "Do you even realize what you're asking for?" Her green eyes sparkled, mischievous and daring. "I think I do," she said softly. Yet there was an edge to her tone, a boldness that made him pause. "And I think I want to find out." Before he could react, she closed the final distance between them. With a sudden fluid motion, she straddled him, her body pressing against his, a daring defiance written in every line of her posture. His breath hitched, an involuntary response to her audacity, and for the first time, he felt the raw intensity of desire that had been simmering beneath the surface all day. "Try me anyway," she whispered, her voice a tantalizing mix of challenge and invitation. The words struck him like fire against dry tinder, igniting a storm he had long kept contained. His warning, his caution about being too big for her was thrown back in the most intoxicating way possible, replaced now by the thrill of confrontation that was no longer playful but urgent, magnetic, and dangerous. For a moment, neither moved. The wind swept across the canyon, rustling the tall grasses and carrying the scent of earth and wild sage. He could feel the heat of her body, the rapid beat of her pulse, and the courage that radiated from her like a tangible force. She was fearless, reckless in the most compelling way, and yet completely in control of her own desire. His hands, massive and strong, hovered near her, unsure whether to yield or resist. The world around them, the rugged cliffs, the fading light, the distant cry of a hawk, faded into insignificance. There was only her and him, the charged air between them and the unspoken promise that this moment would change everything. He inhaled sharply, a growl escaping his throat as he finally let himself respond. The tension between them crackled like lightning in the canyon. He could feel her daring, her boldness, and the way she seemed to dare him to let go of control. And in that challenge, he saw something he hadn't allowed himself to hope for in years. Someone who could meet him, match him, and even tame the edges of the wildness that defined him. Her eyes met his, unwavering and bright, holding his gaze like a mirror to his own intensity. "I'm not afraid," she said, a simple declaration that carried immense weight. It was a statement that resonated deep within him, breaking down walls he had built over years of solitude and survival. And then slowly, he let himself shift, leaning closer, bridging the space that had been charged with tension. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the wind stilling as if the very earth watched their collision of desire. Her whispered challenge had been met, not with caution, but with the raw, unrestrained force of a man who realized that this woman, daring and fearless, was not only his match but his temptation, his storm, and his fire all at once. In that first electric encounter, everything changed. Boundaries were tested, limits were crossed, and a new chapter had begun. A chapter of fire, desire, and the irresistible pull of two souls unwilling to back down. The canyon, now bathed in the soft silver glow of twilight, seemed to embrace them in a private world where only they existed. The fierce energy of the day had softened into a more intimate, almost fragile connection. After the fiery tension of their first close encounter, both were quiet, caught in the rare vulnerability that often follows the storm of desire. He leaned back slightly, his massive frame relaxed but still alert, as if every fiber of his being was attuned to her. For a long moment neither spoke. The wind whispered through the canyon grasses, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust, and the distant cry of a hawk seemed to mark the passing of a moment that felt suspended in time. Finally he spoke, his voice lower, softer, and tinged with something almost like confession. "I've fought many battles," he began slowly. "More than most could imagine. I've seen men fall, villages burn, and people I cared for disappear. All because of the life I was born into. I've survived, yes, but not without scars." His words weren't just about his body. They were about the weight he carried in his heart, the invisible battles that had left him guarded and solitary. She listened intently, the fire of boldness in her eyes tempered by a quiet empathy. She reached out, lightly brushing a hand against his arm, not a touch of seduction but a gesture of connection, an acknowledgement of his courage and pain. "I've had my own battles," she admitted, her voice soft yet unwavering. "Loss, betrayal, mistakes I can't take back. I've built walls around myself too, thinking it would keep me safe. But maybe some risks are worth taking." Her honesty seemed to surprise him. Few people had ever dared to speak so openly in his presence, let alone someone whose spirit was as unflinching as hers. Her words cut through the defenses he had meticulously maintained for years, making him aware that there was a different kind of strength in vulnerability, a strength he had seldom allowed himself to encounter. The canyon's shadows deepened, wrapping around them like a protective cloak, as if nature itself respected the fragile trust they were building. He shifted closer, the brush of his hand over hers a silent promise that her courage did not go unnoticed. For the first time, he allowed himself to be more than the untamed warrior everyone feared. He allowed himself to be human, flawed and real in her presence. "I've hidden who I am for a long time," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion he rarely revealed. "The world sees me as fierce, dangerous, untouchable. But with you, I feel something different. I feel seen." The word hung between them, delicate yet powerful, heavier than any battle scar he bore. She smiled softly, a mixture of warmth and admiration, and leaned slightly closer, her courage bridging the last of the emotional distance between them. "And I feel seen by you too," she confessed. "Not just by the warrior, but by the man beneath, the one who's been fighting silently, carrying the weight of his past." For a long time they sat in silence, letting the canyon hold their unspoken truths. No words could rush the moment. No actions could substitute for the trust they were carefully weaving. Each glance, each breath, each subtle touch was a thread, intertwining them in a connection that was far more profound than any physical encounter. It was in this quiet vulnerability that they began to truly understand one another. He realized that strength wasn't just in fighting or surviving. It was in allowing someone to see the heart beneath the battle-worn exterior. She realized that courage wasn't just daring or defiance. It was in opening herself to a man who could break her, yet might also heal her in ways she had never imagined. As night fell over the canyon, a shared sense of trust settled between them. The intensity of attraction remained, but it had deepened into something richer, something enduring. They had crossed the threshold from mere desire to genuine connection, where secrets were shared and vulnerability became the foundation of their bond. And in that shared quiet, they both knew that their journey, wild, passionate, and uncharted, had only just begun. The following morning dawned crimson and gold, the kind of sunrise that promised both beauty and danger. The peaceful quiet of the canyon was soon interrupted by the distant echo of hooves and gunfire, an ominous sound that tore through the dawn like thunder. The Apache's instincts sharpened instantly. Years of battle had trained him to recognize trouble before it arrived. He stood, his body tensing as he listened. "Riders," he said, his tone suddenly clipped, focused. "Too many." She looked up from where she had been sitting near the campfire, confusion flickering across her face. "Bandits?" He nodded once, scanning the horizon. "They raid the trade routes. They take everything, horses, supplies, lives. If they find us here, they won't ask questions." Her breath hitched, but she didn't falter. "Then we run." He turned to her, his dark eyes fierce. "No, you hide. I'll draw them away." She shook her head, rising to her feet with that familiar defiance he both admired and feared. "You think I'll hide while you fight? Not a chance. This isn't a game," he growled, stepping closer. "These men kill for sport. You'll die if you stay." Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "And if I run, you'll die fighting them alone. I won't let that happen." For a moment they stood locked in silent argument, two forces equally stubborn and unwilling to yield. Then without another word he turned away, pulling a knife from his belt and pressing it into her hand. "If you won't hide, then fight smart," he said, his voice softer but no less intense. "Aim for their weakness. Don't hesitate." She took the blade, her fingers brushing his in a fleeting touch that said everything words couldn't. Then she nodded, determination setting her jaw. Moments later, the riders appeared, 5 of them, dusty and ruthless, their faces half hidden beneath bandanas. They reeked of greed and violence, men who had long forgotten decency. One spotted them and sneered. "Well, look what we got here," he drawled. "A little lady and her savage friend." The Apache said nothing. He moved with the precision of a predator, stepping forward slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. The bandits laughed, mistaking his silence for fear. Then the storm broke. The Apache lunged, swift and brutal. The first bandit went down with a blow so fast it barely registered before he hit the dirt. The others drew their guns, but the warrior was already moving, weaving through chaos like a shadow. Bullets tore through the air, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing off canyon walls. She ducked behind a rock, her heart pounding, waiting for her moment. When one of the bandits circled behind him, she rose, swift, fearless, and struck. The knife in her hand found its mark, catching the attacker off guard. He stumbled, eyes wide, and she pushed him back with all her strength. He saw her then, the Apache, and for the briefest moment pride flickered in his eyes. Not because she had fought, but because she had fought with him, side by side. When the dust finally settled, the canyon was silent again. 3 men lay still. The others, realizing they were outmatched, fled into the distance, their shouts fading into nothing. The Apache stood over the fallen, chest heaving, his dark hair wild and his skin glistening with sweat. He turned to her, his woman who had refused to run, and for a long moment said nothing. Then slowly a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're fearless," he said, his voice low with both admiration and relief. She wiped the dust from her face, meeting his gaze. "You warned me about danger," she said softly. "I told you I'd handle it." He stepped closer, his large hands finding her shoulders, steadying her as much as grounding himself. "You could have died," he whispered. "But I didn't," she countered, her eyes glimmering. "Because you taught me not to fear." He looked at her for a long time, the edges of his wildness softening in the fading light. What she had proven that day was more than courage, it was loyalty. The kind that bound souls together in a way neither of them could ever undo. And as the wind swept over the blood-stained earth, he realized she was no longer just a woman who had challenged him. She was the one who had fought beside him, without hesitation, and in doing so claimed a place no one else ever could. The battle had left the canyon silent again, except for the wind, sighing through the grass like an exhale after holding its breath too long. The Apache stood still, knife dripping with the last trace of danger, eyes sweeping the horizon to make sure it was over. When the final echo of the fleeing riders disappeared into the distance, he turned toward her. She stood a few feet away, dust streaking her cheeks, the hem of her dress torn, hair tangled by the wind. Her chest rose and fell with the aftermath of adrenaline, but her eyes, bright, steady, were fixed only on him. She had survived, she had fought, and in that moment, she was as untamed as the land itself. "You fought like you were born to it," he said, his voice rough but threaded with pride. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "And you fight like the storm itself," she replied softly. "No fear, no hesitation. I've never seen anything like it." He took a step closer, then another, until only a breath separated them. The air between them still crackled with the leftover energy of battle, danger and desire intertwined, raw and unfiltered. He looked down at her, his dark gaze searching her face, and saw what he hadn't dared to believe before. She wasn't just brave. She was his equal. "You could have been killed," he murmured, his voice low, almost a growl. "And so could you," she countered, her words bold but trembling faintly at the edges. The canyon was silent except for the rush of their breathing. Dust hung in the air like smoke from a spent fire, catching the late afternoon sun in golden streaks. He reached out slowly, fingers brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. The gesture was gentle, far too gentle for a man of his size and strength, and that gentleness undid her completely. "I told you I was too big for you," he said quietly, echoing that first warning, the one that had started this wild, uncontrollable connection between them. She tilted her head up, meeting his gaze, and whispered, "Then why do I fit right here?" Her hand pressed lightly against his chest, feeling the solid rhythm of his heart beneath her palm. That was all it took. The restraint he had clung to shattered like thin glass. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her with the ferocity of someone who had spent a lifetime holding back. She rose onto her toes, meeting him halfway, and the kiss that followed was not soft or uncertain. It was desperate, consuming, inevitable. The world around them blurred. The canyon, the dust, the danger, all of it fell away until there was only the fire that roared between them. His hands traced the outline of her back, memorizing the shape of her courage. Hers gripped his shoulders, holding on as if afraid he might vanish like a mirage. When the kiss finally broke, they were both breathless, foreheads resting together, hearts racing in sync. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. He had known many things, battle, loss, victory, but never this. Never a feeling that burned through every barrier he had ever built. She smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "You're not just wild," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "You're alive, and I think I've been waiting my whole life to feel something like this." He looked at her then, really looked, and for once, he saw not a fragile woman, not an outsider, but someone who had walked through fire and dared to stand beside him. His hand cupped her face, thumb tracing the faint streak of dirt across her cheek. "You have no idea what you've done to me," he said, his tone heavy with wonder and warning. She leaned into his touch, her eyes soft but unyielding. "I think I do," she breathed, "and I'm not sorry." The last light of day melted into twilight, painting their skin in copper and shadow. The heat of battle had turned into something else entirely, something they could no longer deny. In the stillness, where danger had once raged, passion bloomed, fierce and unstoppable, and as he held her close, the Apache warrior, who had spent a lifetime surviving the world, realized that for the first time he was no longer merely surviving. He was living. Morning crept quietly over the canyon, spilling pale gold light across the rugged ridges and sleeping earth. The air smelled of sage and smoke. In the soft hush of dawn, she woke to the sound of a fire crackling and the low hum of a song, a melody deep and haunting, like the earth itself was remembering. The Apache sat by the fire, back turned, bare to the waist, the scars on his shoulders catching the light. His voice carried that old tune across the morning air, a language she didn't know yet somehow felt. It was sorrow and pride, love and loss, woven into one. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and watched him for a long while before whispering, "What does it mean?" He didn't turn. "It's for the ones who came before," he said, "for the blood that keeps us standing." He glanced over his shoulder then, eyes softening when they met hers. "For the ones we protect." Something stirred inside her, an ache maybe, or awe. "It's beautiful," she said, barely louder than the fire's crackle. He gave a small nod, almost shy. Then his tone changed, quiet but edged with caution. "But it's not your song." She flinched, not from anger, but from the truth of it. He was right. She didn't belong here, not to his people, not to his ways. Her world had been one of polished manners and quiet obedience. His was wild, sacred, older than anything her books had ever told her. Still, she couldn't help but rise, step closer, and say, "Teach me." He turned fully then, eyes narrowing slightly as if to read her soul. "You want to wear feathers you didn't earn?" he asked. "To speak words that aren't yours?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I want to understand you, to know what makes your heart beat the way it does when you sing." For a moment, silence stretched between them, tense, fragile. Then slowly his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something like respect. "Understanding takes more than words," he said. "It takes walking through fire with someone." Her lips curved faintly. "We already did that," she reminded him. He looked at her long and hard, then motioned for her to sit. When she did, he handed her a carved piece of wood shaped like a flute. "Then start with breath," he said. "Our songs begin where silence ends." The lesson began awkwardly, her attempts thin and uncertain, the sound breaking, squeaking. He chuckled once, deep and quiet, the sound rumbling from his chest. But then he moved behind her, his large hands guiding hers on the flute, his breath warm near her ear. "Don't fight it," he murmured. "Let it flow through you like wind through the canyon." And when she finally did, the note came clear and trembling, a sound that seemed to blend with the rising sun. He didn't speak, but she saw the pride in his eyes, the rare softness that only surfaced when he forgot to guard himself. "You learn fast," he said, voice low. She smiled, breathless. "Maybe I was just waiting for the right teacher." For a moment, something deep and unspoken passed between them. But the stillness broke when the sound of hooves echoed faintly in the distance. His expression hardened. He rose instantly, scanning the ridge. "They'll come looking for you," he said. "Your people. And when they see you with me." He didn't finish, but the meaning was clear. She stood too, heart pounding. "Then I'll tell them the truth, that you saved me, that you're not the monster they think." He turned to her, face unreadable. "They won't listen. They never do." She stepped closer, her voice fierce now. "Then they'll have to learn. Because I'm not leaving you." He stared at her. This woman who had walked out of the civilized world and into his, refusing to bend. And for the first time, he didn't see her as a stranger in his land. He saw her as part of it, defiant, alive, unafraid. He reached out and took her hand, rough fingers brushing her palm. "If you stay," he said quietly, "you become part of my story. And that story isn't easy." She squeezed his hand. "Neither was my old one." The rising sun washed them both in light, erasing the shadows that had lingered between their worlds. For the first time, they stood not as two sides of history, but as something new, something fragile and beautiful that neither culture could name. The peace they had built in the canyon was fragile, like a flame hidden in cupped hands. For a few stolen days, the world beyond the red cliffs and whispering wind didn't exist. They hunted together, shared food by the fire, and spoke in fragments of each other's languages until words weren't needed anymore. But peace in the Wild West never lasted long. It started with a single distant gunshot, then the thud of hooves rolling through the valley. The Apache lifted his head before she even heard it, every muscle in his body tensing like a bowstring. His instincts screamed what his voice didn't. They were being hunted. She rose from where she'd been washing clothes by the stream, her hands trembling. "Who is it?" "White men," he said grimly. "Soldiers, maybe. Or bounty riders." Her heart sank. "For me?" "For me," he said, though his eyes softened as they met hers. "But they'll use you to find me, or to make me surrender." The sound grew louder, men shouting, dogs barking, the crash of brush as riders closed in. The Apache grabbed his rifle and moved with a silent grace, scanning the cliffs. "We need to move, now." They ran, up through narrow rock paths where sunlight barely reached. Dust and fear filled her lungs, but she didn't stop. He led her to a small cave hidden behind a curtain of vines, motioning for her to crouch low. "They'll track us," she whispered. He nodded. "They always do." Through the cracks of the rock, she saw them. 6 riders in dust-stained uniforms, rifles glinting under the sun. One of them dismounted and lifted something from the ground. Her shawl. She had dropped it by the stream. The soldier called out, "She's with him." "The Apache took the woman." Her blood turned to ice. "No," she whispered. "They'll kill you." He looked at her calmly, though his voice carried quiet fire. "They've been trying to kill me my whole life." Before she could stop him, he was already moving toward the cave's mouth. She caught his arm. "Please don't go out there. We can find another way." His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. "If I run now, they'll never stop hunting you. They'll say I stole you, or worse." Tears welled in her eyes. "You didn't steal me. I came to you." He brushed a thumb across her cheek, the faintest smile ghosting his lips. "Then live to tell them that." And before she could answer, he was gone. The next few minutes stretched like eternity. She crouched in the dark, heart pounding, hearing only muffled voices and the occasional crack of a rifle. Then silence, too long, too heavy. She couldn't take it. She stumbled from the cave, screaming his name into the dry wind. "Kano." The world seemed to hold its breath. And then he appeared, emerging from the dust, limping slightly, rifle slung over one shoulder. Behind him, 3 of the riders lay scattered across the ridge, motionless. The others had fled. Her knees nearly gave out. She ran to him, clutching at his chest, tears streaking down her cheeks. I thought they'd..." He rested a hand on the back of her head. "Not today." But she could see the blood on his arm, the exhaustion in his eyes. The truth pressed down on her chest like a weight. They wouldn't stop. More would come, the army, the townspeople, everyone who saw their love as sin or betrayal. She whispered against his skin, "We can run east. Start over." He shook his head slowly. "You can. I can't. My people need me." Her heart clenched. She wanted to fight fate itself, to tear down every wall that divided them. "Then I'll stay," she said fiercely. "Whatever comes." He looked at her for a long, silent moment. The woman who had walked into his life like wildfire and refused to leave even when the world turned its guns toward them. "You would defy them all for me?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "For us." And in that wind-swept canyon, surrounded by blood and sunlight and the echo of what they had survived, he finally understood. Love wasn't her weakness, it was her weapon. The horizon burned red as the sun sank. They stood together, knowing the war between their worlds had only just begun, but neither stepped back. The canyon was quiet now, but the memory of the battle still hung heavy in the air. Dust swirled in lazy eddies, catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun. The Apache and the woman stood side by side, bruised, bleeding, and exhausted, but alive. More importantly, they were together. He looked at her, eyes dark and intense, reflecting the fire that still burned in both their hearts. "The world won't forgive this," he murmured, voice rough. Our love. What we've done. They'll never let it be. She shook her head, her chest rising with determination. Let them try. We've already survived more than anyone imagined, and we've survived together. A slow smile tugged at the corners of his lips, the first one in days that wasn't tinged with tension or shadow. He reached out, brushing her hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. You defy me in every warning I've ever given, he said softly. Yet I can't stay away from you. And you don't have to, she whispered, stepping closer until their foreheads touched. I'm not afraid. Not of the world. Not of you. Not of anything that comes next. For a moment, silence reigned. The kind of silence that isn't emptiness, but full of everything unsaid. The weight of their trials, the intensity of their passion, the depth of their bond. And then, as if the earth itself acknowledged the inevitability of their union, the wind picked up, swirling around them in a gentle embrace. He cupped her face in his hands, dark eyes scanning every line, every scar, every corner of her spirit. I promised myself I would never be tamed, he admitted. And yet, you've done it anyway. You've taken what I didn't think could be given. She smiled, lips brushing his in a soft, fleeting kiss. And you've shown me what it feels like to be alive, she said. To be wanted, feared, loved, and understood all at once. Then, as the canyon held its breath, the final shift happened. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so close it felt as if their souls had already merged. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing herself against him, not as a surrender but as a declaration. You're mine, he whispered, voice low and feral, not in possession but in recognition, acknowledging that they belonged together. No matter the odds, and I'm yours, she replied, fierce and unwavering, her green eyes blazing with trust and passion. Forever. The world beyond the canyon, its rules, judgments, and dangers, could rage as it pleased. But here, in this stolen moment, they were unstoppable. Their love had been forged in fire, tested by blood, and tempered by courage. Nothing outside these cliffs could ever undo what had been claimed by heart and soul. He lowered his forehead to hers, inhaling her scent, tasting the wildness she carried into every part of him. We'll face them all, he said, voice strong, sure. Together. And no one will break us. She laughed softly, the sound bright and alive, lifting the weight of everything they had endured. We'll make them see, she said. See that what we have is more than rules, more than fear. It's ours. And in that moment, the canyon became a sanctuary, a symbol of their resilience and passion. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gold, mirroring the fire that blazed within them. Their bodies pressed together, not just in desire, but in devotion, a testament to the union that nothing, not men, not bullets, not the weight of the world, could ever undo. He whispered one last promise, lips brushing her hair. No matter the night, no matter the storm, you'll never fear again, not with me. She smiled, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I don't, she whispered, because we're unstoppable, together. And so, amidst the wind, dust, and fading light, two souls, wild, fierce, and fearless, claimed their forever. A love forged in the crucible of danger, passion, and unwavering courage.